We're all familiar with the account in Daniel chapter 3 of Shadrach, Meshach and Abed Nego, who refused to bow down to the king's golden image, and so they were cast into the fiery furnace. We know that God brought about a great miracle of deliverance for those three men, and that the king himself saw not three men in the fire, but he saw four men walking in the fire, and one of them looked like the Son of God. We're all so familiar with this wonderful example to us of the boldness, the faith, the courage that we should exhibit as Christians. But I want to look at the circumstances leading up to these three young men, these three courageous young men, these men of great faith and integrity being thrown into the fiery furnace. So picking up in verse 1 of Daniel chapter 3, it says, Nebuchadnezzar the king made an image of gold, whose height was 60 cubits and its width 6 cubits. This thing is around 90 feet tall and 9 feet wide. It's huge. And King Nebuchadnezzar sent word to gather together the satraps, the administrators, the governors, the counselors, the treasurers, the judges, the magistrates, and all the officials of the provinces to come to the dedication of the image which King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. So the satraps, the administrators, the governors, the counselors, the treasurers, the judges, the magistrates, and all the officials of the provinces gathered together for the dedication of the image that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. And they stood before the image that Nebuchadnezzar had set up. Then a herald cried aloud, To you it is commanded, O peoples, nations, and languages, that at the time you hear the sound of the horn, flute, harp, lyre, and psaltery, in symphony with all kinds of music, you shall fall down and worship the gold image. And whoever does not fall down and worship shall be cast immediately into the midst of a burning fiery furnace. So at that time, when all the people heard the sound of the horn, flute, harp, and lyre in symphony with all kinds of music, all the people, nations, and languages fell down and worshipped the gold image which King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. We need to see this as a warning, particularly for the Western church. The reason I say we need to see this as a warning is because there is something very subtle going on here, which actually on first reading we don't pick up. But I want you to see what is not said in the decree. It tells us here that the image is set up, they're commanded to come to the dedication of the image, and it is said, at the time you hear the sound of the horn, flute, harp, lyre, and psaltery in symphony with all kinds of music, you shall fall down and worship the gold image that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up. I want you to see that this only creates a problem for the Jews. The other religions who were represented in the Babylonian Empire at the time feel perfectly okay to come and worship this image that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up. There's nothing in this decree that says, come and worship this image, and you shall only worship this image. You shall put aside your gods and worship this image only. It just says you shall come and bow down and worship this image. Whatever religion you are, whatever faith background you're from, it's okay. You can still carry on doing that thing. You can still carry on worshiping your gods. All we're saying is that you have got to come and fall down and worship this image as well. You see, for other religions, this was not a problem. But for the Jews, this presented a huge, huge issue. Why? Because when we go back to the Ten Commandments, we see what God says to the Jews. Exodus chapter 20, beginning at verse 1, says, God spoke all these words, saying, I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. You shall have no other gods before me. When it says before, It doesn't mean ahead of. If I am standing before the king, I'm not standing ahead of the king. I'm not in front of him in the queue. What it means is I am standing in his presence. So when it says, you shall have no other gods before me, it's saying you shall have no other God beside me. You shall have no other God in my presence. No other God in my presence. That means you are to worship the Lord your God and serve him only. There is to be no compromise. There is to be no little adjustments just to fit in with what the spirit of the age is saying. You shall have no other gods before me, besides me, in my presence. These three young men are faced with a choice. Do we bow down to this image and compromise? Do we still say, well, it's okay, we're still Jewish, we're still okay, all we've got to do is bow down to this image? No, God says, you shall have no other God before me, no other God besides me, no other God in my presence. It was something that the Jewish nation, throughout their history, were battling with. You would have kings who would worship other gods. There were high places, and even though you had the worship of the true God in the temple of Jerusalem, there were still high places around Israel where other gods were sacrificed to. Baal, Asherah, and so on, and so on, and so on, and so on. They were besides the Lord, their God. And if you turn to 2 Kings and chapter 16, we see an account of King Ahaz. 2 Kings, verse 16, beginning at verse 10 says, Now King Ahaz went to Damascus to meet Tiglath-Pileser, king of Assyria, and saw an altar that was at Damascus. And King Ahaz sent to Urijah the priest the design of the altar and its pattern, according to all its workmanship. This king has gone to a Gentile place. He has gone to a place where other gods are worshipped, and there he sees an altar. And he thinks, wow, that's impressive. That's good. That's wonderful. And so he says to the high priest, he says, make me an altar like this. Make me an altar like this. It's an altar to a foreign god. And he has this altar made in the temple. And it tells us this. If we go to verse 14, it says, he also brought the bronze altar which was before the Lord from the front of the temple, from between the new altar and the house of the Lord, and put it on the north side of the new altar. Then King Ahaz commanded Urijah the priest, saying, on the great new altar, burn the morning burnt offering, the evening grain offering, the king's burnt sacrifice, and his grain offering. He commands that to bring his new, impressive, wonderful altar in, that the altar to the true God is moved from its rightful place. The problem comes when we bow down to anything other than the Lord our God. Then the Lord our God is moved in our hearts, in our affection, in our purpose, in our worship to a lesser place. And then he just says, well, what I will do is I will bring my sacrifices to this new altar, but then if I need to inquire of the Lord, then I'll go to the bronze altar. So many people are doing this. They're compromising left, right, and center. But when they really get into trouble, then we can turn to God. It's compromise. It's compromise. It's compromise. It's a terrific danger to the church. The danger of bowing down to anything other than the Lord our God. We still say we're Christians. We still go to church. We still do all the things that we do. It's okay. We can still go to church. We can still have our religious freedom. All we've got to do is bow down to what the spirit of this age is demanding we bow down to. We saw it with Nazi Germany, where the church, so long as it didn't make a stand against the Nazi regime, so long as the church didn't make a stand against the appalling treatment of the Jews and what was happening in the Holocaust, so long as the church didn't make a stand against that, as long as they bowed down to the Nazi ideologies, then they could still be Christians. They could still go to church. It was compromise. Whatever ideologies that we are facing in the age in which we live, God is saying today, this is a warning to the church. You shall not bow down to them or worship them. For I am the Lord your God. You shall have no other God before me. When the devil tempted Jesus in the wilderness, he took him to a high mountain and he showed him all the kingdoms of the world and their glory. And he said, all of this I will give you. All you have to do now is bow down and worship me. You can still be the Son of God, Jesus. You can still heal the sick. You can still do all the things that you came to do. Just bow down and worship me and I will give you all of this stuff. I'll make it easy for you. You don't have to suffer persecution. You don't have to suffer these things. Just bow down. Just bow down. Well, praise God. Jesus answered, it is written, you will worship the Lord your God and serve him only. We need to have the attitude of Joshua in chapter 24 of the book of Joshua. If we just turn there very, very briefly and then we will close. Joshua chapter 24, beginning at verse 14, says this. Therefore fear the Lord. Serve him in sincerity and in truth, and put away the gods which your fathers served on the other side of the river and in Egypt. Serve the Lord. And if it seems evil for you to serve the Lord, choose for yourselves this day whom you will serve, whether the gods which your fathers served that were on the other side of the river, or the gods of the Amorites in whose land you dwell. But as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. Remember the admonition Jesus himself gave us. He said, you cannot serve God and mammon. No one can serve two masters. You will either love the one and hate the other, or you will despise the one and love the other. You cannot serve two masters. We cannot bow down at two altars. We must choose today to worship the Lord our God and him only, not to compromise, even if it leads to us being thrown into the fiery furnace, being thrown into prison, even if it means being rejected by the society in which we live. The church has a decision to make. Choose this day whom you will serve.